Okay, we're jumping straight into a profoundly dark, unflinching investigation of what the author of our source material considers literally the greatest crime ever committed against human evolution. We're going to completely invert the traditional comic book understanding of good and evil. Seriously, we're examining a philosophy that argues with absolute ironclad conviction that the people we've historically viewed as the good guys are actually the architects of our own profound decay. And the historical villains, the ruthless, dominating conquerors, well, it argues they were the only ones morally and biologically correct. The text opens with a massive, radical challenge to philosophers who just blindly worship the will to truth. Like, why do we automatically assume truth is inherently better than untruth? What if the truths we hold so deeply today, ideas like universal equality, pity, humility, what if they're actually just highly functional deceptions? Think about it. What if they are a very specific kind of untruth, perfectly designed to protect the weakest members of society, but doing so at the devastating expense of true human greatness? Our source material paints a downright brutal picture of the modern crime scene. It claims humanity has been systematically reduced to a sickly, subservient herd. According to the text, we are absolutely not the apex of evolution. We're a domesticated, dwarfed version of what a human being could be. It argues we've been actively bred to be obliging, mediocre, and, frankly, fundamentally harmless. But how exactly did this happen? How did the human animal completely lose its teeth and its wild, conquering spirit?
Which brings us to Section 1, the crime against greatness.
So, here's the argument. Traditional religious and democratic movements actually weaponize these concepts to poison human greatness and protect the weak. The text specifically calls out early religious movements and their modern heir, the democratic movement, not as forces of love, but as forces of profound resentment. To protect the vast surplus of failures and the sickly, they had to totally sabotage all natural values. They made pride a sin. They made the love of earthly supremacy a vice. They demanded the absolute sacrifice of freedom and self-confidence, demanding subjection and self-derision instead. The so-called good guys didn't just accidentally stunt mankind, they executed a calculated plot to invert all natural laws. The author looks at the preservation of all this sickness and weakness with total horror. By comforting the sufferers and actively keeping alive what biologically should have perished, these moral systems worked systematically for the absolute deterioration of the European race. They took what could have been a masterpiece of evolution and turned it into, as the quote says, a sublime abortion. Section 2. Tyranny of the weak. The herd literally invented what's called slave morality. It's a system where the desperate survival tactics of the weakest are artificially rebranded as ultimate virtues. Imagine for a second that you're oppressed, weak, and genuinely terrified of the strong. What moral code do you invent? Well, you invent an undeniable psychological defense mechanism that condemns your oppressors. You become highly suspicious of power and independence, and instead, you elevate the traits that make your miserable existence slightly more bearable, right? Sympathy, the helping hand, patience, humility. The text forcefully argues this isn't noble at all. It's purely a morality of utility. Now, just notice the grand deception happening here. The weak didn't actually defeat the strong in a contest of physical or intellectual strength. No, they just rewrote the dictionary. They made it so that being stupid and safe became a moral virtue, while being strong became a sin. Under slave morality, the person you're supposed to admire is the one who poses absolutely zero threat. The good man is the safe man, maybe even a bit foolish and easily deceived. Conversely, the powerful, dangerous, and dreadful individual, the one bursting with natural vitality, is labeled evil. It's a masterful linguistic trick that let the herd gain supremacy simply by making the strong feel deeply guilty for their own natural power.
Section 3. The will to power.
Look, the real world just isn't about equality or pity. It's a harsh, elevated reality driven by an inescapable biological imperative. When you finally strip away the sentimental weakness of modern society, when you look at nature without that softening, comforting filter of herd morality, what do you actually see? You see a world entirely defined by tension, struggle, and overcoming.
The source material defines the absolute engine of the universe, not as political ambition, but as the will to power. It's the raw, vital necessity of living. This right here is the core biological thesis of the whole argument. Literally everything in organic life, from the simplest cellular functions of nutrition and assimilation all the way up to the grandest clashes of civilizations, is driven by one single biological imperative: the desire to grow, to gain ground, to attract to itself, and to acquire ascendancy. It is the intrinsic will to life itself.
So we actually have to reclaim these weaponized words. Exploitation and conquest are not sins according to the text. They are the fundamental facts of all history and biology. We've been deeply conditioned to cringe at words like injury or suppression, but the text insists on unflinching honesty. A living organism absolutely must appropriate and exploit its environment to survive and thrive. To outlaw exploitation is to literally outlaw life itself. It's not about being depraved, it's about recognizing the primary organic function of a healthy, living entity.
Moving on to Section 4. The master as creator.
Master morality operates in the unforgiving light of truth. It completely rejects the herd's utility in favor of an exalted, unyielding strength. This is the unapologetic morality of the conqueror, the men of prey who possessed unbroken strength of will. And you know what? They didn't look outside themselves for validation or approval. They experienced a feeling of absolute plenitude and power, operating in a state of raw, unfiltered nature.
Notice the massive shift in terms here. The master naturally equates good with nobility and truth, viewing the weak not as evil, but really just as despicable and deceitful. The master doesn't even use the word evil. To the master, good simply means being like themselves, powerful, severe, and radically honest. The opposite isn't evil. The opposite is bad, meaning pathetic, cowardly, and untruthful. The master despises the dog-like man who just lets himself be abused, because such a man totally lacks the basic dignity of power.
The so-called villain doesn't need society's approval. They elevate the human species by creating their own values out of a superabundance of power. They are totally autonomous. When they help the unfortunate, it isn't out of the sickly, bleeding heart pity of the herd. It's an overflow of their own immense power and wealth of spirit. They are the actual artists fashioning mankind, the driving force that pushes human potential into higher, rare, and far more comprehensive states.
Section 5. Who is the real villain?
The texts argue with total conviction that trying to outlaw exploitation and enforce absolute equality is quite literally a principle of dissolution and decay. When modern Democrats, anarchists, and socialists howl for a society free from masters, free from exploitation, and defined by universal equality, they're actually demanding a dying organization. They're asking us to invent a mode of life that refrains from all organic functions. It is literally a suicidal impulse disguised as moral progress.
And the final reality presented by the text is this. Every single elevation of mankind has relied on an aristocratic society, unbroken strength, and, yes, the suppression of the weak to build a foundation for greatness. The text uses this beautiful, brutal metaphor of the Cipa matador vines in Java. These vines encircle an oak tree, using it as scaffolding, actively suppressing it until they can break through the canopy into the open light and exhibit their happiness. A healthy society must accept the sacrifice of a legion of individuals so that a select class of beings can elevate themselves to higher duties. Society isn't an end in itself, it is simply the foundation, the scaffolding for true greatness.
Which leaves us with this incredibly provocative thought. By blindly championing the herd and fighting for modern equality, are you actually the villain actively holding back the ultimate evolution of mankind? If the historical conquerors were merely acting in accordance with the fundamental laws of nature, pushing human potential to its absolute zenith, then our modern moral outrage is really just the whining of a domesticated species afraid of the wild. Think about that the next time you hear someone demanding universal equality. Are they fighting for a better world? Or are they just fighting to ensure that no one is ever allowed to be truly great again?